Okay, imagine living in a world where just one single accusation could completely destroy your career, alienate all your friends, and turn you into an enemy of the state overnight. Welcome to the early years of the Cold War. It was an era totally defined by the shadow of the atomic bomb, huge global ideological struggles, and this pervasive, creeping panic that infiltrated literally every single corner of American society. Today, in this explainer, we're going to explore the rapid rise and the explosive downfall of McCarthyism. We'll look at exactly how fear was weaponized, how conformity became a survival tactic, and how the echoes of this age of anxiety still resonate for us today. Okay, let's dive into this explainer. We're going to take a quick 5-part journey today. First, we'll look at the atmosphere of fear. Second, McCarthy enters the stage. Third, the culture of conformity. Fourth, the fall of McCarthy. And finally, we'll wrap up with a lasting legacy. All right, part 1, an atmosphere of fear. Or, as I like to think of it, the geopolitical tinderbox. So, to really understand how McCarthyism took hold, we've got to rewind to the late 1940s. The absolute panic that swept through the American public, well, it wasn't just made up out of thin air. It grew from a super rapid succession of very real world-altering events. Just think about this timeline for a second. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests a nuclear bomb, which completely breaks the American monopoly on the ultimate weapon. That same exact year, China falls to communism. And then, by 1950, over 300,000 U.S. soldiers are deployed to fight a massive land war in Korea. I mean, if you're an everyday citizen reading the morning paper back then, it literally looks like global communism is just advancing unstoppably across Europe and Asia. The fear of a World War III, an atomic one this time, was absolutely everywhere. And, this global anxiety bled straight into domestic policy. And it was fueled by actual real cases of espionage. There really were Soviet spies operating in the U.S. You had Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were convicted and eventually executed in 1953 for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Then there was Alger Hiss, a high-ranking State Department official who was convicted of perjury after being accused of spying. Now, these were isolated breaches, sure, but they were severe, and they triggered massive, sweeping actions from the government. President Truman actually gave in to the political pressure in 1947 and issued a loyalty order, which subjected federal employees to these intense loyalty reviews. The House Un-American Activities Committee, often called HUAC, ramped up their hearings, and the McCarran Act forced communist organizations to register. Basically, the government started casting a massive, massive net. Which brings us to part 2, McCarthy enters the stage. The match is lit. So, by early 1950, the American public is completely on edge. The government is aggressively hunting subversives. The tinderbox is essentially soaked in gasoline, right? And the spark? Well, that arrived in Wheeling, West Virginia. Enter Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin. During his speech there, he just bursts onto the national scene with this brilliant piece of political theater. He famously waves a sheet of paper in the air, telling the crowd that he holds in his hand a list of exactly 205 names, 205 people, he claimed, who were known members of the Communist Party, and get this, who were currently working and shaping policy right inside the U.S. State Department. Now, what's really interesting here is how fast that story changed, because actually, McCarthy had no list, none at all. When journalists and his colleagues started pressing him for details, that number of 205 mysteriously shrank down to 57. Then, suddenly, it was 81. Finally, he just promised he'd disclose the name of one single top Soviet agent. These constantly shifting numbers definitely brought some ridicule from his critics, but honestly, the terrifying truth was that it simply didn't matter. The baseless claims were sensational. They won him immense national fame and violently fanned the flames of the ongoing Red Scare. Now, not everyone was fooled, of course. As early as June 1950, Frida Kirchwey, the editor of The Nation magazine, hit the nail on the head. She accurately called it out as a cynical subversion of justice, used purely to boost people's political fortunes. A lot of President Truman supporters and progressives just kind of hoped this whole political witch hunt and hoax would blow over quickly. But the fear was just too strong. The McCarthyism that bore McCarthy's name had already taken root super deep in American soil. Moving on to part 3, the culture of conformity, or the crucible. So what started out as a political witch hunt rapidly morphed into a rigid, society-wide demand for total cultural conformity. Anti-communism infected everything: cities, towns, the suburbs. Playwright Arthur Miller famously compared it to the Salem witch trials in his play The Crucible. Because to be safe, you couldn't just stay neutral. You had to actively prove you were aggressively American.
Imagine for a second sitting in a crowded, brightly lit hearing room, cameras flashing everywhere, facing a panel of lawmakers and hearing this chilling refrain. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? HUAC used this intimidating question over and over again, especially during their highly publicized investigations of Hollywood. They didn't just want confessions, they pressured witnesses to name names of friends and colleagues. And if you refused to cooperate, you were held in contempt.
But, some people did stand their ground. Black entertainer and civil rights activist Paul Robeson absolutely refused to be intimidated. When they called him before HUAC in 1956, he completely turned the tables on his inquisitors. He straight up told them, "You are the un-Americans, and you ought to be ashamed of yourselves." He pointed out they were punishing him for his civil rights activism, not his politics. But man, the cost of that bravery was immense. Robeson's U.S. passport was revoked, his music was banned, and hundreds of film artists, including the famous Hollywood 10, were blacklisted and completely barred from working in the industry for a decade.
During this incredible age of anxiety, religion and patriotism practically merged to create this shield against suspicion. The whole narrative became an all-out battle between godless communism and God-fearing Americanism. And honestly, it didn't even really matter what religion you followed. President-elect Eisenhower even said in 1952 that the government needed a religious faith, quote, "and I don't care what it is." To prove our national piety, the words "under God" were officially added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and "in God we trust" became our national motto in 1956. Basically, if you shun these values, you were wide open to attack.
This constant rallying against communism demanded total conformity from everyone, making any behavior deemed deviant incredibly dangerous. For instance, middle-class women who had entered the workforce during World War II were heavily pressured back into the home to maintain the traditional family, which was viewed as this bulwark against atheistic totalitarianism. Black soldiers coming home from the war were expected to just quietly accept Jim Crow segregation. Gay Americans, who were already heavily stigmatized, were actively hunted out of government jobs in what became known as the Lavender Scare. The logic there was that their secret lives supposedly made them prime targets for Soviet blackmail. And broadly speaking, left liberals and anyone advocating for social justice were just completely smeared as subversives.
All right, Part 4, The Fall of McCarthy and the Army Hearings.
Following the 1952 elections, McCarthy really hit the absolute peak of his power. He became chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations and immediately went after the voice of America. But then, his abrasive fearmongering went a bit too far. He set his sights on the U.S. Army, publicly berating officers and claiming leftists were being secretly promoted. As his mudslinging got more and more unrestrained, it finally created some cover for his critics to speak up. In March 1954, the highly respected CBS journalist Edward R. Murrow took to the airwaves. Murrow looked right into the camera and told his audience that McCarthy was causing alarm among our allies and giving comfort to our enemies. Murrow noted, super accurately by the way, that McCarthy didn't invent the fear, he just masterfully exploited it. The tide was finally starting to turn. The real climax of this whole era arrived during the 1954 Army McCarthy hearings. For 36 days, 20 million television viewers sat glued to their screens watching this drama unfold live. When McCarthy tried to publicly smear a young lawyer working for the Army's head counsel, Joseph Welch delivered this absolutely devastating emotional rebuke. He looked at the senator and asked, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" It was the exact question the entire country had been waiting to ask. And just like that, the spell of invincibility was broken. Let's look at how fast this builds into his downfall. Step 1. The intense public humiliation of those televised hearings completely shattered his reputation. Step 2. By December of that same year, 1954, his Senate colleagues finally found their courage and voted 67-22 to formally condemn his actions. And step 3, stripped of all his power and influence, McCarthy just rapidly faded into irrelevance. He unfortunately succumbed to alcoholism and passed away just a few years later, in May 1957. He was only 48. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, A Lasting Legacy, The Long Shadow. By the late 1950s, the absolute worst of the panic was over. Stalin had died, the Korean War armistice had eased some of those immediate global tensions. But, and this is crucial, McCarthy's tactics easily survived the decade. The most enduring of these is what we call red baiting. This is the act of smearing a political opponent by linking them to communism or some other demonized extreme ideology. McCarthy might have been its most famous practitioner during the Cold War, but he was definitely not the only one. Red baiting basically became a standard tool in the political playbook. It was used instinctively to attack the New Deal, liberals, and reformers of all stripes. In fact, The machinery of anti-communism successfully launched some of the most massive political careers of the 20th century. Take Congressman Richard Nixon, for example. He used his highly prominent role on HUAC and his aggressive pursuit of Alger Hiss to literally catapult himself into the vice presidency alongside Eisenhower and eventually right into the Oval Office. Ronald Reagan is another great example. He bolstered his Hollywood fame by testifying before Congress and doing corporate anti-communist work. He charted his own course into public life and, as we know, eventually the presidency. Fear was a proven, incredibly effective springboard to power.
However, the source material we're looking at notes a really heavy cost to all this political maneuvering. It argues that the leftist American tradition was left completely in tatters. According to the analysis, movements for social justice, everything from early civil rights organizations to gay rights to feminism, faced massive suppression and huge delays under the crushing weight of Cold War conformity. Which leaves us with this final, really critical thought to ponder. We've seen how fear of an external threat was turned inward, how it was weaponized to demand conformity and just destroy careers. So ask yourself, if the politics of fear and conformity were so easily weaponized back then during the Cold War, how might these exact same red-baiting tactics, smearing opponents by linking them to demonized ideologies, how might they still be shaping the way we view political opposition today? Seriously. Look at the media you consume or the political speeches you hear. The age of anxiety might have kicked off in the 1950s, but the tactics of McCarthyism, they are still very much alive. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep asking the tough questions.